Добър вечер! Здравейте с българското издание на MS Build 2022 After Party, на което ще направим малък анализ на нещата, които са показани на този ивент от Microsoft и съответно ще изгледаме някои от интересните сесии. Днеска моя първи гост е Ники Павлов, който е заместник декан на ФМИ към Пловдивския университет. Здравей, Ники!
Здравей, Мишо! Благодаря
Много,
за поканата.
много се радвам, че си тук с нас и преди да видим първите видеа, които са от MS Build с някои от най-интересните нови анонсменти, можеш ли ми кажеш какво ти правиш и въобще какво правите с майкрософтските технологии в ФМИ на Пловдивския университет?
Това, което мога да кажа, че ние сме един от малкото университети в България, а може би и не само, където имаме много силно застъпено използване на майкрософтски технологии преподаването. Докато повечето университети наблягат на Java, на Python, на C, при нас много от предметите се преподават на C#, обектно-ориентирано програмиране, например, алгоритми и структури от данни ги водим на C# вече. Също така започнахме да внедряваме в учебната програма и предмети като разпределени приложения, бизнес анализ на данни, бизнес информационни системи, където също внедряваме технологии като SQL Server, Power BI. Имаме планове да развием повече и други Azure услуги, но това го оставяме за в бъдеще.
Аз разбрах, че има интерес също така да се направят курсове свързани с low-code, no-code платформи, като Power Platform на Microsoft. И това всъщност е нещо като по-скоро добра идея, все още не е реализирано, доколкото знам. И ми се иска, преди да те питам какво ти е харесало в MS Build 2022, да започнем с едно кратко видео, където Сатия Нателла всъщност говори за low-code платформите на Microsoft. Така че това ще е нашето първо видео, което пускаме и след него ще имаме допълнително коментар от наша страна.
About low code, no code. In a digital first company, the developer workflow influences how the entire company works. Fusion teams of pro developers and domain experts integrate across all functions and disciplines, enabling closer collaboration. And we're continuing to innovate to make this even easier for you. Today, we are announcing Express Design in Power Apps. You can upload a PDF, a PowerPoint, or even a hand-drawn sketch. As you can see here, an Express Design will convert it into an app within seconds. It's pretty fantastic. This includes a complete UI that's built from your design with a back-end data schema. It's easy to check and modify all of the created components. You can further modify any part of the app to match your own design. And if you want to add more screens, you can simply repeat the process until your app is completed. For example, the interaction designer who's using Figma every day can build a prototype in Figma, upload the design into Power Apps, and have a working app in seconds, leaving developers to focus on data and backend logic. And by the way, this is all built on large AI models that I just talked about. And we're not stopping there. Today, I'm very excited to announce Power Pages, which enables anyone to build modern, secure, and responsive business websites fast. Power Pages offers a wide set of design, development, and security options, along with simple authoring and advanced admin options. We've already seen people use Power Pages to do meaningful and much-needed work. In Portugal, Edgar Simoes wanted to encourage the public to donate goods to help an influx of refugees. He used Power Pages to host and build his app, allowing him to launch a site with no HTML or web skills. He went from idea to impact in just days. Let's take a look.
O que há em Portugal, oficialmente temos pelo menos mais de 20 mil refugiados ucranianos. O meu nome é Andrey e sou da área das economias. Quando eu comecei o Ukraine Live Aid, que acho que fui chamado como um dever quase.
Em Portugal, os nossos corações estão com a Ucrânia. Falamos sobre a recolha dos produtos alimentares, medicamentos dos primeiros socorros para ajudar refugiados que começaram vida em Portugal do zero.
Realmente havia muitas fontes, havia dispersos de dados sobre os centros de doação. A primeira coisa que eu pensei foi que faltava talvez aqui um mapa ao vivo. A Ukraine Live Aid usa toda a Power Platform. A primeira versão da aplicação foi feita em menos de 2 dias, mas a minha experiência na área da programação é quase nula. Power Pages torna fácil o desenvolvimento de websites e tem a vantagem então de ser também de low code e portanto tudo monta-se visualmente. E o Ukraine Live Aid está a resolver a questão do acesso à informação integrada. Os nossos utilizadores quer que sintam que o Ukraine Live Aid é uma comunidade. Eu acho que a interação é importante. Se tens um centro de doação ou sabes que é assim perto de ti ou tu até fazes parte, diz-nos, ajuda-nos e isto só vai ter uma escalabilidade e sucesso com a ajuda de todos e todos contam aqui.
Това беше първото видео, което всъщност анонсира няколко интересни неща като Power Pages в Power Platform. Power Pages реално дават възможност с low-code технология да правим сайтове, корпоративни сайтове, интранет сайтове и различни по-популярни веб приложения. Ники, на тебе какво ти направи впечатление от всички новини, които бяха съответно анонсирани на Microsoft Build, като неща, които са ти интересни, които мислиш, че имат наистина висок импакт към технологиите и бъдещото развитие на IT технологиите?
Първото нещо, което ще спомена, са именно Power Apps и Power Pages. Зная, че за нас, софтуерните разработчици, като пюристи, това е нещо, което ние гледаме с презрение и с насмешка и игнорираме. Смятаме, че това са несериозни инструменти, от които трябва да стоим надалече, които да не използваме. Само че аз винаги съм считал, че това е едно арогантно и неразумно отношение и се сещам за историята на Visual Basic. Още първият инструмент за бързи приложения, който се появява в света, реално, който набира популярност на Microsoft. И какво голямо влияние оказва той върху цялата индустрия, защото заради него после имаме инструменти като Delphi. Заради него имаме после тулове в Java и инструменти в .NET за приложения. И това са инструменти, които позволяват на неспециалисти наистина да разработят бързо приложения, които работят, от които те имат полза и които работят достатъчно добре и вършат работа. Затова наистина, както и Мишо спомена, ние имаме планове да се опитаме да разработим курс по Power Apps в Пловдивския университет, тъй като има наистина хора, които с тези инструменти могат да получат доста добра стойност. Колкото до самия билд, тази година ми направи впечатление, че липсваше изявени новини. Обикновено в билд има поне няколко новини, които са за много ключови, много важни технологии. Тази година като че ли липсваха такива. Споменах се изключително много теми, но в много различни насоки. Направи ми впечатление, че Microsoft Teams започва да еволюира вече до платформа за приложения. Той отдавна не е просто чат, както много хора си мислиха първоначално. И Slack дори имаха, как да кажа, арогантността да се присмеят на Teams, като възможност да им бъде конкуренция. Но в наши дни вече Teams се доказва като инструмент без конкуренция на пазара. Той се превръща в една платформа, с която различни услуги се надпреварват, буквално да се интегрират. И това се получава. Той става нещо като браузър за приложения сам по себе си.
Аз бих казал,
Друго,
че
което...
имаме,
Да,
аз бих
да,
казал, че
разбира
имаме
се.
много различни важни новини, така че може би защото също така имаме различни важни новини, може би се оказа, че не се вижда някоя, която е много интересна и много по-важна от другите. Просто в различен аспект бяха тези неща. Да, Ники,
Да,
извинявай.
смятам, че ти го формулира много правилно, Мишо. Преформулира моите думи по начин, по който аз не успях. Действително, новините са важни и никой не може да победи останалите. Много отчетах добре внедряването на разширяването на Azure услугите в посока за Cloud Native приложение и особено Azure App Container услугите, които най-накрая позволяват вече да разработваме по-лесно разпределени приложения в микросервиси, които трябва да бъдат контейнизирани, понеже не всеки микросервис трябва да бъде контейнизиран, без да изискваме да бъдем системни администратори. Съжалявам, но за мен DevOps е системен администратор на стероиди. Не виждам защо измисляме нова дума за тази професия, но без да се налага ние да менажираме контейнери, Docker, Kubernetes, за нас облакът прави това. Както ни дава ресурси, вместо ние да управляваме сървъри, по същия начин сега имаме инфраструктура, която да бъде управлявана вместо нас, а ние можем да се съсредоточим върху задачите. Подчертавам това, без да искам да омаловажа другите новости в Azure, било то в Cognitive Search, в AI областите, но там не съм специалист, не бих коментирал. Също така мога да отбележа най-накрая MAUI, новата технология за многоплатформени приложения на Microsoft, наследникът на Xamarin, която най-накрая достигна релиз версия. Интересен ми е фокусът, който Microsoft залагат на нея. От една страна, като че ли няма много пазар, тъй като повечето фирми разчитат на native или на веб-базиран модел за разработка на приложения, но въпреки това Microsoft продължава да полагат усилия и допускам, че все пак ще търсят някакъв модел, който за универсална разработка на десктоп, native, мобилни приложения, който обаче да не е свързан само с една технология. Тъй като знаем, че MAUI на Android работи върху native стека на Android, също важи за iOS, а за Windows разчита на WinUI 3, новия SDK, който излиза Windows 10 и Windows 11. В тази връзка впечатление прави и усилията, които полагат да възстановят пазара Microsoft Store на приложения в Windows. Отново той получава, така да се каже, някаква грижа, след като беше изоставен дълги години. Както и с нови модели за реклами, нови модели на възвръщаемост, просто да го направят много привлекателен за потребителите. И личи опит Windows да бъде наложен отново, но не толкова като операционна система за компютрите, а просто като платформа, интегрирана тясно с облака. Да може човек вече да не се интересува дали работи на локалния си лаптоп или в облака, просто ресурсите му да са винаги споделени и лесно да превключва между двете.
Да, благодаря
И
ти.
последното, което мога да спомена и с това завършвам, е Blazor, който продължава да бъде развиван и макар той да е повече към web, и говорят вече за Blazor Native, т.е. да пишем web приложение по долно електрон, само че да не е на JavaScript, ами да е на C#. Което за някой като нас, които не искаме да учим JavaScript, това е една чудесна новина.
Дали трябва да учим или не JavaScript, това е една друга тема, но аз разбирам твоята радост по отношение на Blazor. Ние сме поканили и един друг виден представител на пловдивското комюнити, Андрей Николов. Здравей!
Здрасти. Благодаря за поканата, Мишо.
Много се радвам, че се отзова. Андрей е човек, който е известен с много интересни качества. Той е всъщност много добър разработчик, който разбира от бази данни, много известен в Power BI средите, въпреки че прави много специфични за Power BI всъщност неща. И в това отношение мисля, че и неговото виждане за нещата ще бъде доста интересно. Какво ти хареса в последния билд и естествено в контекста на нещата, които те интересуват повече?
Ами аз да подхвана от там, откъдето Ники свърши. Нали, просто когато се каже Blazor Native, за мен е точно това. Нали. Вместо да си пишем native приложения на C-Sharp, нали, под Windows, дайте да ги направим, нали, многоплатформени и за да избегнем JavaScript, дай пак да си пишем на C-Sharp. Нали, малко така изглежда. Нали, но иначе Blazor като цяло също е една много интересна технология, която имах така възможността напоследък малко да се поработя с нея, да пуснем един-два проекта в продакшн. Така че това също е интересно. Иначе като цяло аз не че много успях да погледам в детайли. Нали, все пак нали, евентът е много наситен, с много сесии и човек не може отначало да фане всичко. Заредил съм си така един хубав списък с неща, които да си доизгледам, нали, в следващите дни. Но това, което в последно време Microsoft прави и доста така наблегнаха според мен на този билд евент на него е вкарването на AI в много различни области. Това, което на мен най-ми е от полза, тъй като аз не съм AI специалист, нали, не се занимавам много с такива проекти, това е интеграцията с development, с редите за разработка и така нататък. Примерно анонса, че GitHub Pilot ще бъде безплатен за атендитата на Build. Това още не съм успял да намеря откъде да си го получа безплатно, нали? Но много ме блазни като възможност, защото с новия, как да го кажа, Code Complete, който ми дава Visual Studio 2022, това е доста така често използвано от мене и да кажа, че клавиша Tab почна да се поизтърпва на моята клавиатура. Много често използвам клавиш Stana. И просто ми се иска малко да си поизцапам ръцете, да го видя самия GitHub Pilot в действие. Все още съм в листата за изчакване, не съм го получил реален достъп до него, но беше любопитен анонс. Това е едната страна, нали, за интеграцията на AI към development платформата и като цяло другата част, нали, която анонсираха за развитието на development платформата. Те пуснаха Visual Studio Code наскоро да бъде достъпно в браузъра, т.е. да можем в браузър директно да си пишем нещата, без изобщо, нали, нищо да не ми се налага да инсталирам на моя компютър. Това е много удобно, нали, в зависимост от това с какъв софтуер се занимаваш, разбира се, но примерно един Azure Native Developer, човек, който пише Azure функции, App сервизи, такива неща, нали, апта, който се занимава с бази администриране на Azure, това е една чудесна платформа. За него няма нужда от кой знае какви тулинги да се инсталират и би могъл от всеки не особено мощен компютър, нали, това да го започне. И в тази връзка ми направи впечатление и за анонса на Project Volterra. Microsoft отново се връщат на пазара на десктоп компютрите, така да го кажа. Като ако не сте чували, за хората, които не са го чували, значи това е, за мен бих могъл да го кажа, пряк конкурент на Chromebook, MacBook Mini и този тип компютри, т.е. мъничко компютърче, ARM базирано на Snapdragon процесор, което е директно насочено към разработчици, нали, ползващи Visual Studio и подобни технологии. И ми е интересно следващите дни да понауча малко повече за него. Те анонсираха, че ще бъде изкалируемо, т.е. можеш няколко PC-та да ги вържеш в стек, да направиш нещо по-мощно. Това е едно нещо, което така много интересно ми стана и ми се иска да го пипна. Нещо такова. По принцип, аз имам много добри впечатления от хардуера, който Microsoft прави. Преди 20 години беше емблема, да кажеш, мишка Microsoft. Все още, нали, от най-добрите мишки, които съм пипал, са тези на Microsoft. Но оставайки отново на development платформата, С една друга моя страст, която се чувъркам напоследък, Azure Virtual Desktop, те анонсират една друга услуга, която е базирана на Azure Virtual Desktop, и това е DevBox. Това е, представете си, тотално менажирана от Microsoft виртуална машина, готова, конфигурирана с всички development тулове. Това си е пълноценен Windows на 64-битов процесор, разбира се, а не ARM като Project Volterra. И това тясно се интегрира с Azure Virtual Desktop и Microsoft 365. Тоест, човек вече в рамките на буквално минути може да си спинъпне нова девелопмент среда от нулата, без да е зависим от служебния си лаптоп, или може да вземе, нали, стария лаптоп на детето, който е 6 годишен, нали, да почне да коди на него без някакъв проблем. 3D игри. Това, нали, ми направи доста така впечатление от анонса на Build.
Аз ще те прекъсна тук само да кажа, че наистина това, което прави Microsoft и което и на мен ми харесва, е, че нещата са за разработчиците. Или старото послание developers в осъвременен контекст. Защото всички тези неща преди години бяха започнати по съвсем друг начин. Спомнете си Windows RT, което беше също първия Windows на ARM процесори, където се използваха обаче масово популярни приложения, точно като Chromebook. Сега отиваме в посока неща удобни за разработчиците. И точно тук ние имаме голямо предимство, защото вие знаете, особено за големите компании, за ентерпрайсите, колко сложно става, когато трябва едни хора да почнат да разработват системи, няма значение като служители, контрактори, под някаква форма за тези компании. Какво security има, как се правят сетъпи, политики и така нататък. Всичко това може да се демократизира по начина, по който Microsoft предлагат нови решения.
Абсолютно, да. Който не си е чакал лаптопа на една седмица, той не знае какво е.
Абсолютно. Аз мисля да продължим, след като пуснем още едно видео на Сатия Нателла, което е свързано с Microsoft и хибридния AI. Както знаете, Microsoft много набляга на решения, които са с Edge Analytics и Edge AI, и точно тук в съвременните решения Microsoft предлага нови неща. Мисля, че ще е интересно за нашите участници да споделим това и след това ще продължим.
We just talked about the progress we're making with our AI supercomputer. But if there's one thing that I believe that will surpass the AI supercomputer, it's the supercomputing capacity that will be distributed across all the devices we carry and use throughout our lives. In the last 2 years, we have created 50 times more GPU compute on Windows compared to the biggest AI supercomputer. And with the advent of NPUs, this will only grow. We're entering a world where every Windows computer will draw on the combined power of CPUs, GPUs, NPUs, and even a new coprocessor, Azure Compute. In this hybrid cloud-to-edge world, you will be able to do large-scale training in the cloud and do inference at the edge and have the fabric work as one. We are very excited about how it will enable both us as well as our partners like Adobe to create a whole new class of experiences in their applications. We also want you to build cloud-native applications with these rich AI models where they can offload for local inference wherever NPUs are available, whether that's Android, iOS, or Windows. You should be able to optimize for the device and the local capability you have. It's why we've built a powerful cross-platform development pattern for building AI experiences that span the cloud and the edge. This pattern allows you to make late-binding runtime decisions on whether to run inference on Azure or the local client. It can also dynamically shift the load between client and cloud. We are calling it the hybrid loop. We're bringing this to you as a cross-platform capability through the Onyx runtime and Azure ML, along with an AI toolchain to make heterogeneous targeting easy. And to bring this to life, we're also announcing Project Volterra. It's a Windows dev kit with an ARM CPU and NPU. And it includes native ARM64 Visual Studio and .NET support to provide the same fast, familiar, and highly productive experience that you're used to. Let's take a look. Project Volterra will be available later this year, and you can get started today by building on our cloud and taking advantage of all these fantastic AI tooling and services. And it's just the beginning of what will be possible.
Така, това беше прекрасното представяне, според мен, на този Hybrid AI и Project Volterra, за който Андрей спомена.
Точно.
Аз знам, че Андрей има интерес и към други неща, свързани с базите данни, с SQL Server, Development, Power BI. Какво друго ти направи впечатление?
Ти каза SQL Server. Естествено, значи на скорошния анонс за новата версия на SQL Server 2022. Нали, това са интересни неща, но напоследък аз така имам възможността да се занимавам малко повече и с Azure. И Azure Function по-скоро имам предвид така, голямо удоволствие да пишеш подобни неща. И нещото, което така доста ме зарадва мене като анонс, е възможността да имаме байдинг и с SQL Server, или в частност по-често бихте го използвали, да речем, с Azure SQL Database, или с Management Instance, разбира се, нещо подобно. Но имаме възможност, както в обикновените Azure функциони, имаме възможност да си направим binding, output binding, да речем, към някакъв table storage, Cosmos DB и нещо такова. Вече имаме възможност това да го ползваме, да речем, с Azure SQL Database, което вече навлиза повече в моята област, тъй като аз повече с SQL Server се занимавам, отколкото с Cosmos DB и подобни. И това лично мен изключително много ме улеснява. Става много, много лесно да вдигаш някакво API, да си експознеш базата, да направиш крут API, буквално с 5 реда код, от които един ред код е да ретривнеш данните от базата и 4 реда от код да ги върнеш обратно. Нали? Тоест да направиш input binding и output binding към база, да речем Azure SQL Database, и serverless код да си пуснеш с Azure Functions. Това ми звучи страшно привлекателно и би така доста намалило количеството код, който пиша в момента, да се занимавам с connection стрингове и такива неща. И просто вече ме сърбят ръцете да видя къде ще го вкарам в употреба. Защото...
Скоро ще измислим, обещавам ти.
Да. Ние много си харесваме в нашия екип Azure Functions и понеже използваме основно Azure SQL Database в нашите проекти, това ще ни улесни много. Просто този анонс ми беше така при сърце, така да го кажа.
Ами в такъв случай, може би, ние можем да пуснем сега на нашите участници също представянето, което е за Azure Functions и SQL Bindings. И след това ще имаме още малко време за интересни новини. Така че в момента аз ще споделя точно това видео, което представя Azure Functions и SQL Bindings.
Hi, I'm Drew Squires-Kabala, Program Manager here at Microsoft, generally focusing on databases and experiences for developers with SQL. I'm here today to talk about Azure SQL and Azure Functions, now with an improved integration through SQL Bindings. I'm excited to talk about this because these are two great products for developers. Developers love Azure Functions for its serverless capabilities. You get to bring your own code, whether it's C#, Python, JavaScript, Java, PowerShell. You get to bring your own code and especially oftentimes shipping it right out of source control through the integration with GitHub and Azure DevOps. Similarly, developers love Azure SQL because it's a strong relational database with graph support. There's a large selection of drivers and SDKs, which means that just about any language you're working with, you can work with Azure SQL. While there's a whole different family of Azure SQL options, there is a serverless option with Azure SQL Database where you pay for what you use. Azure SQL also has integration with GitHub and Azure DevOps, so no matter where your code is going or where it's been, as long as you're bringing it into source control, you've got great deployments. When you integrate Azure SQL and Azure Functions, you can build some really impressive apps. With Azure Functions, you can incorporate functions bindings, bringing in like HTTP requests, blob storage, notifications, even pumping out push signals with SignalR. Maybe you're focused more on data and you want to supercharge your data ingestion for stream analytics by combining Azure Functions and Azure SQL. If you have existing applications, integrating Azure Functions and Azure SQL means that you're able to bring in even more applications into your stack. Now, if you're looking to enrich your data with cognitive services, Azure Functions will allow you to do that. There's so many ways to integrate Azure SQL and Azure Functions to build a better app, but the core of it often comes down to a scenario where you're creating an API on a SQL database. This is really common, yet there's always so many kind of it depends types of questions that you have to answer. How much flexibility do I need to have? How much customization do I need to have? How many endpoints do I need to build? And so you start asking questions around, how do I want to build this API? Oftentimes, Azure Functions is a great product for building APIs, but maybe you want to start with using an API package, like a framework, and putting that on top of your database to automatically expose a set of API endpoints based on the tables. You might lose some flexibility, but this can be a really efficient way to get a bunch of endpoints quickly. Now, on the other hand, if you really need to be able to customize your APIs, you can use the SQL SDKs and drivers directly. You build your code for the app logic, so that's great customization ability, but then you also have to open and close the database connection, handle the queries. There's a lot of code to write there. If you need that level of fine-tuned and fine-grained customization, that's a great option. But with SQL bindings, we can start talking about a middle ground where you gain some efficiencies because SQL bindings is handling the SQL connection for you, and then you're worried about the app logic and exchanging the data within the function objects. I put it in the middle here, not because SQL bindings are the only solution. You can use SQL bindings with Azure functions that also have the SQL drivers in them, so you can have some functions with really high level of customization, while other functions are more efficient to write because of SQL bindings. But SQL bindings are a great way to quickly create APIs on SQL databases, and that's why I'm super excited that we now have public preview for SQL bindings and Azure functions for C#, JavaScript, and Python. While SQL bindings bring that kind of efficiency and making those functions easier to build, that doesn't mean that they're not for real enterprise scenarios. SQL bindings on Azure functions do support managed identity authentication to Azure SQL Database, so you can use specific managed identities to go along with each application. The input and output SQL bindings give you two different data flows. The first one is the input, where you're reading data into the function. It's coming from the database, so you'll have your SQL query results, and they become an object in the function. The output binding, on the other hand, saves data from the function into the database. You'll have an object in the function, and it gets inserted into a SQL table. Let's take a look at what both of these look like in functions, both C# and JavaScript. For the input binding, you do need a few attributes to go with this input binding to set it up. Now, they're not too complex. The first one is going to be the query or the stored procedure that you want to run. Optionally, you can pass parameters into that query. And then last but not least is the connection string. The connection string setting is actually the name of the app setting where your connection string goes. No connection strings in code. That is such a relief to see. Your connection string name will be in app settings, whether you're developing locally or on Azure. That means that that connection string name can be used again and again in different functions as needed, as long as you put that same connection string name. Let's pose the hypothetical. I'm building a sample API for a product list. I need to pass an API response to my front end that's giving me product IDs and names in an array. I want to build this with input bindings, starting with C#. In this code example here, we have a query where that select product ID and name from DBO products means that we're running that query as soon as the function starts to run. The function starts when it gets that HTTP trigger, and from there it runs the query against the connection and SQL connection string app settings and puts that in that SQL result object. The function itself is really, really short because we don't need to manipulate those results at all at this point. If we needed to change the result or correlate it into more data, we could certainly do that before returning it with the OK object result right there. But in this case, if the query result itself is exactly what we want to return, that's what we can do. And it's so quick and simple. Let's take a look at how we would build this in real time in VS Code. Here in VS Code, I have the MS SQL extension installed and the Object Explorer open now, connected to an Azure SQL database. I also have an Azure Functions project started for C#. But I know that I want to return the results from the Sales LT product table. If I right-click on this table in the Object Explorer, there's a new menu option for Create Azure Function with SQL Binding. This is going to help me out in building this new Azure function. I'm going to call the function product list, and I will leave the company.function namespace and set the access rights to anonymous. The type of binding we're building right now is that input binding, because we're taking data from Azure SQL into the function. And right before our eyes, VS Code put together this C# function that takes an HTTP trigger and with the SQL binding that runs a query against the sales LT product table, will pass that result back to the user. Before we can test this, we know we need a SQL connection string. So we're going to head over to our local settings file. And in the process of creating that function right from Object Explorer, VS Code set up our connection string for us, minus the password. I'm going to go ahead and put that password in there, and then we'll test out that function. Now that we have our password in our app settings, we can go ahead and hit F5, and this will build our function and fire up the function's runtime locally. Whether you're developing locally or in Azure with functions and SQL bindings, you can still run them and test your SQL bindings. So now we have our product list endpoint exposed, and we can go ahead and test it. So let's send that GET request and make sure we're getting the result back that we expect. And so there's our array of products with the attributes that we have in the table. So those are the columns that correspond to our product table right there in the result. So that is how quick it is to establish an API on top of a table with the SQL bindings. Taking a look back at the JavaScript functions, if we look at JavaScript and input bindings or Python and input bindings, they're a little bit different in that the function definition is split into two parts. The first is the function.json file, and then the second is going to be a script file, either JavaScript or Python. For the function.json file, this is where our bindings definition is. So we'll have the direction for the input binding, as well as the type of binding that it is SQL. The name in this definition is the name of the attribute that's being passed to our script function. So in this case, it's named products, and we have a products parameter going into that function. The command that we're running on our database is just select product ID and name from products, and that's our SQL connection string setting. The script is really short because we're not manipulating the products object at all. We could certainly change things, consolidate, work with the data, add our app logic. That's the great part. But at its core, all we're doing is returning the response body of product right back to a user. It would look just like with our C# option. Now, I did want to mix things up a little bit with JavaScript, because for input bindings, you can build a lot of APIs, but those APIs are serving something. They're oftentimes serving some kind of application, a mobile app, a front end. And so in this case, we're going to take a look at JavaScript input bindings when they're correlated with a front end, in this case with Azure Static Web Apps. We have a static web app that is a React app with two services that it's calling. It is looking for a list of categories from the Contoso store, as well as a list of products. But in this case, the product call that it's making also has a query string on it. Kind of makes us think that it's trying to filter by that category ID. And we need to build the APIs to go along with this. We know that Azure Static Web Apps integrate great with Azure Functions. But in this case, we're also able to pull in SQL bindings to the Azure Functions to make our APIs all that much easier. So the category list is just like we saw earlier in the function JSON. We've got a query set as the command text, and then the function itself just passes categories back. Now the product list is a little bit different, because in this case now we're using parameters where the query string for category ID is being placed in a parameter and then used in the command text. So we are filtering where the sale end date is null, so we're still selling these products, and the parent category is category ID. With these two APIs, we're able to light up our front end with data right from our database. So if I start up our, let me clean up that terminal, make it easier to see. If we fire up the static web apps emulator with our APIs and our React app, we're going to be able to see what this front end looks like with SQL bindings passing it data. So in this case, we have our Contoso Adventure products portal, all lit up by SQL bindings. We have our list of categories down here. And if we select a category, we get that list of products to go along with it. So if we search for components, we get a bunch of bike parts. If we search for accessories, we get helmets and tires and tubes. So we're able to pass information back and forth between these APIs and our front end. You can see the API calls being made with that category ID query string that's passed back to the functions serving the static web app. So this is what input bindings look like when they're feeding right into a front end. You can enrich them with those parameters to really narrow down the data you want to look at. That's enough on input bindings. Let's take a look at output bindings. For output bindings, a reminder that you're taking data out of the function and into the database. So the two things that you need to configure an output binding is just the destination table and the connection string. A lot of the setup comes from setting up the object in the function with the data that you need to go into the database. So that object in function is going to correlate to the table that it's going to in the SQL database. The example that we think of most commonly for APIs and output bindings is you want to send a post body to an API. So you've got some kind of JSON that someone is sending to your API. And you need to be able to parse this to pass it and create, in this case, a new product. If we wanted to create a test product with the color red and a list price of $20, how would we go about this? With output bindings, for example, with JavaScript, we'd have the same two files set up where the function.json has our binding definition. The new product object is something that we need to set up in the function. The command text is the DBO products table, and our connection string is still in SQL connection string. The function is a little bit longer than what we saw before with input bindings because, again, we're populating that object with the data that we want to save to the database. In this case, I'm reading the request body directly into new product. I'm not introducing any app logic into it just yet. If we take this example right over to what the C# output binding looks like, in this case, the table name and the connection string are in that function definition. And we know that we need to set up new product, the object, those attributes, to go ahead and insert that information into the database. We're going to take a look at what that looks like with C# now. So we used C# earlier to create an input binding. Now we're going to create an output binding. Our goal is to be able to send this post request where we're saving that test product right to the database. So if I go into my functions, I have an add product function started. I've added the SQL binding. And it's actually able to take in a collection of products if we'd like. We could go ahead and add multiple products at a time. In this case, we know that we're going to be testing a single product. So I can read in that request body right into my function. And I'm going to convert that string into an object product. We know what our product table looks like. That's the SQL down there at the bottom in the comments. And I've converted this to a more strongly typed class. It's going to allow me a little bit more robustness as we introduce a little bit of app logic here. In this case, as we look at the weight value, I've got people that are going to be sending me the weight in pounds, and I want to be able to convert it to kilograms. The other kinds of things that we can do is if we have default values, such as the modified date is right now, we can go ahead and set this as well. But if I go ahead and put an approximate kilogram conversion in there, I can now set my weight to adjust for the pounds to kilograms conversion. Now, when I save product to the database, it'll save the conversion for me. Let me make sure I get my notation correct there. There we go. So we know get it side by side so we'll get it clear as possible. We know we're passing in this information. We also want to save a start date and a modified date, so we're adding that to our object, as well as the weight that we're going to be passed is 12 for 12 pounds, and we want to convert that to kilograms before we save it to the database. Though that is the extent of the app logic that we're doing here. But like we talked about earlier, Azure Functions integrated with Azure SQL is a great opportunity to introduce additional richness to your data. We could be calling out to get sales tax information. We could be introducing cognitive services for AI. There's so many opportunities to use and focus on your app logic and how powerful your app is, since you're not worrying about managing the SQL connectivity. Let's go ahead and hit F5 and fire this up. As I hit F5, it's going to go ahead and build our function, and we'll be able to test it by posting this body to our function. And you might have noticed, if you're eagle-eyed, that the connection string setting we're using here in the output binding is the same as the one that we used in the input binding. So we're able to reuse that connection string in app settings without having to worry about putting our connection string in our code or anything like that. We're able to follow best practices a little bit more easily. Now our functions are ready for us. So let's go ahead and test it. Let's add a new product. And we got a 200 OK. Good news is our weight was converted from 12 pounds to 5.4 kilograms. Now this product just happens to be in the accessories category. So if we go over to our static web app, and I'm going to click back on to accessories, at the bottom we can see the test product that we just added. So in real time we're able to leverage all of our different kinds of bindings. Our input bindings here are feeding this React app, while our output binding was allowing us to insert this data right into our database. One thing that I would be remiss not to mention is, what about that great ability of Azure Functions to build our code, put it in source control, and leverage the great integrations for CI/CD, especially with GitHub for Azure Functions? With SQL, there's something called SQL projects, and for SQL code deployment, it's a fantastic way to use all of your database object code in a way that'll compile to an actual schema model. So locally, you have a copy of all of the object definitions. And with SQL projects, you're able to leverage managed deployments. So what happens is, if you build your SQL project and then deploy it, the difference between the SQL project's schema model and the database that exists is calculated for you. So if a table needs to have a column added, instead of trying to recreate the table all over again, the tooling is smart enough just to add that one column. Well, you don't have to worry about that. You can use SQL projects in VS Code, Azure Data Studio, and Visual Studio. And with GitHub, the SQL action is available that manages both the build and deploy for you. Really quickly, popping back into VS Code, what our SQL project looks like for AdventureWorks, the database, is over here in our files. There's a couple of folders for tables and stored procedures. There's an additional view for database projects that focuses just on the project itself and makes it easier to get to certain actions like build and publish. The other kind of developer delight that SQL projects opens up for us is it really enriches our ability to develop locally. You've been seeing me test and work with Azure Functions right here on my laptop. That's great. But what if I want to work with my database locally? With SQL projects, you can publish to a new container that it sets up for you right off the bat, so you're not worried about, oh, have I connected to production? Am I causing problems there? No, you are a developer. You are working on a development instance. Like I mentioned with the SQL action for GitHub, my deployment for this static web app and database is a single GitHub action. There is a step for the static web apps deploy. We've got our static web apps API token. It knows where our React app is in the Azure Functions in the API folder. We also have a step that builds and deploys our Azure SQL schema. So if we need to add a new table to AdventureWorks, we can do that right here locally. And then when we put that into source control, when we push our changes, it's going to connect to our Azure SQL database, build our SQL project, and apply those changes. The data stays there, and just the changes to the schema are made. It's fantastic. I'm not going to lie, it is really fantastic. So check it out. If you go to ak.ms/Azure Data Studio-SQL projects, you can find out more about getting started in either Azure Data Studio or VS Code. It is cross-platform along with those, so it's a nice way to really dig into SQL development, especially as you integrate with something as flexible as Azure Functions. Earlier, I talked about how Azure Functions with SQL bindings are ready for enterprise use with managed identity authentication. Just a little bit more detail on that here for you now is that you're looking to secure your database access with managed identity. Instead of using a universal admin account or one of those other terrible ideas that sometimes accidentally happen, what we really encourage to happen is to enable either the system-assigned identity or even create a user-assigned identity to your function app. You could do that right from the Azure portal. And then create a database user in your Azure SQL database just specifically for that function access. That T-SQL down there in the lower left corner would take that identity name and in this case only allow that user ability to read and write data. You're not going to be able to manipulate objects, but you can really focus that user scope down even further to just the specific objects that they should have access to. When we saw the connection string earlier in app settings, it had a user ID and password. This was for a test instance, but ideally you're setting up managed identity authentication and your connection string removes user ID and password and moves to authentication equals Active Directory managed identity. That'll really get you up and running. That is all I have to show for you today with SQL bindings. It is time for you to build with SQL bindings. You can either work now in public preview for C#, JavaScript, Python, so you get to decide what kind of enrichment do you want to do on your database. Do you want to build a new database with SQL projects? Do you want to take an existing database into SQL projects? But you can do that all with SQL bindings for Azure Functions.
Така, Андрей, мерси за препоръката. Мисля, че това беше наистина едно доста интересно видео за това как може да използваме Azure функции с SQL Bindings. Аз бих искал да те попитам допълнително, понеже знам, че ти си един от хората, които много се занимават и с Power BI, ти си лидер на Пловдивската Power BI юзер група. Какво около Power BI и Power Platform се появи в тази годишното издание на Build?
Ами, ние Power BI юзерите като цяло сме доста разглезани в това отношение от Microsoft, защото буквално всеки месец сме бомбардирани с нови функционалности, кои от кои по-интересни. Power BI има много така интензивен релиз сайкъл. Постоянно излизат нови неща, за да го обогатяват. Но едно от нещата, които ми направи много така хубаво впечатление последните няколко дни, много често, не знам дали на теб ти се е случвало, но много често на мен ми се случва да срещам въпроса: окей, сега направих си един страхотен репорт тук, как да си го експортирам данните, нали, да си го изпратя по имейла на шефа, към CSV, към Power BI, не знам, не Power BI, PowerPoint, нали, или PDF, но специално за експортирането на данните от CSV към CSV. До сега винаги на това нещо съм отговарял: ами не дей експортирай от Power BI репорта, кънекни се директно към Data Source и си вземи данните оттам. Което обаче означава, че трябва винаги да внимаваме, когато си правим Power BI репортите, да си имаме, нали, добър Data Store, където си съхраняваме Single Source of Truth, т.е. добре да сме си структурирали нещата, да нямаме много логика в самия Power BI репорт. Но едното от нещата, които анонсираха и изкараха вече в General Availability, имаме едно Execute Queries API. Знаете, аз винаги обичам да тормоза хората, нали, на тема API-та. Има възможност, в момента има Power Automate Action направен, чрез който може да си сложите DAX код и да си екзекютните срещу Power BI dataset от вашия репорт и това нещо директно да ми върне резултатите. Тоест в Power Automate много лесно вече може да си направите точно това, нали, от вашия Power BI репорт да се екстрактнат данните към CSV, да речем, или от там нататък вие веднъж като си вземете данните, може да си направите с тях каквито искате формати, но да си автоматизирате много хубаво нещата, да речем в някакъв flow такъв, или пък просто докато си тествате репорта. Хубавото е, че с това нещо работят, нали, identity-та, може да си ползвате row level security, да си правите тестове на репортите, т.е. когато го публично, т.е. като юнит тест на данните и на базата. Изобщо това нещо отваря много така хубави възможности за средите, в които съм аз, нали, програмистката част, нали, от дейтабейс света, а не само дизайнерите на репорти и писането на логика. Това е нещото, което доста ми не е хвана окото и смятам в най-скоро време да го използвам в практиката си.
Наистина това са интересни неща. Имаше повече анонси за Power Automate и нещата около Power Automate са свързани с... Да, точно така, и за Power Pages. Споменавам Power Automate, защото той се интегрира с всички други продукти от Power Platform и не само, за най-различни Automated Flows. Там имаше някои интересни неща, свързани също с използването на изкуствен интелект, интеграцията на виртуални машини за Unattended RPA, неща, за които, за съжаление, няма да имаме време в детайли в тази сесия. Какво би ти си искало да видиш, може би, на Build или скоро от Microsoft? Това ще е последното нещо, което искам да те попитам, преди всъщност да завършиме нашия ивент с последното видео от Microsoft Build.
Не знам, трудно ми е да преценя. Винаги така с интерес очаквам Build. Microsoft като цяло си пази най-интересните анонси за него. Така че нека да видим какво ще ни изненада следващата година. Съм сигурен, че ще ни изненадат доста приятно в това отношение.
Да, Microsoft е една от малкото компании, която прави повече от един световен глобален ивент. Както знаете, Ignite е един друг голям ивент, където се анонсират много неща, но там обикновено се анонсират повече неща, свързани с платформите, а за програмисти, за девелопери, най-много неща обикновено ние научаваме на Build. Така че от чисто програмистка гледна точка, може би наистина на Build са най-интересните неща. Това беше причината и да подберем също за край на нашата сесия видеото, което е свързано с .NET MAUI. Всъщност, както вече говорихме, това е наследника на Xamarin с много нови възможности, много предизвикателства. Предполагам, че ще бъде интересно на всички програмисти, настоящи, бъдещи, минали, всички, които искат и се вълнуват да опитат да разработват приложения. Благодаря ти много, че беше днеска с нас и знам, че ще има след около 10 на дни едно интересно събитие в Пловдив. Организираме Data Saturday Пловдив на 11 юни в хотела Рамада, в нова локация, на по-високо ниво, основно присъствено. Надявам се да се видим с много от вас там и приятно гледане на последното видео.
Благодаря още веднъж за поканата и хубава вечер и от мен.
Хубава вечер!
Hello, everybody. I'm Maddie Montequilla, and I am a product manager on the .NET MAUI team, coming to you from my house to talk about .NET MAUI roadmaps and updates. Now that we are released, it is build. We have .NET MAUI. It's shipped. It's GA. We're very excited. And if you haven't heard of .NET MAUI yet, it is our cross-platform framework for building mobile and desktop apps with .NET, with C#, with XAML, all the things you know and love. And it's got a single project, a single code base that deploys to all of these different targets. So you can deploy to all the different devices, but still access the native device capabilities that you'd expect from a mobile or a desktop app from a single API. You don't have to write a different implementation for every platform you're on. And of course, with the amazing productivity tools you get from Visual Studio. So it's currently in Visual Studio 17.3 Preview 1. So the .NET MAUI SDK, the actual code, the development kit has been GA'd. Tooling is in preview for one more release so that we can make sure we get all of the fixes and new features out to you as quickly as possible. So you're going to want to download the preview version of Visual Studio. It's just visualstudio.com/preview. And then you'll be able to check off .NET MAUI as an installable thing and get started right away. So why on earth should you use this MAUI thing besides the fact that it's amazing? Well, first of all, with .NET 6 and with all of the .NETs in the future, it's really a unified system. We have a unified base class library. All of our types are unified. There's CLI support with MAUI. We have the modern SDK style projects. And of course, the modern support lifecycle you get with the .NET framework or .NET ecosystem. You get both desktop apps and hybrid desktop apps, which we're not going to dive into too much in this talk. There's a lot of great content on it already on the internet. But really what that means is you can stick an existing Blazor app, your Blazor app that runs in the web, you can put it in a .NET MAUI app and run it on your desktop, whether that's Windows or Mac, which is really, really cool. And that's using the Windows App SDK framework under the hood on Windows, of course, and then the Mac Catalyst framework under the hood for Mac OS. So you can build fully native desktop apps for both of those platforms, whether you want to use XAML and C# and write it all native from the get-go, or if you want to take your web app and put it into the .NET MAUI app to run it natively. And of course, one thing we love talking about on the .NET team is just how productive you are with .NET. Not only with Visual Studio and the features you get from that, such as your visual diagnostic suites and XAML Hot Reload and .NET Hot Reload, but also, of course, with things we do in the SDK in .NET itself, like using Microsoft extensions, our single project framework for .NET MAUI, so you can put all of your images in one place, all your fonts in one place, not have to copy them on all the different platforms you're targeting. And it is amazing. There are a lot of things we did under the hood to make MAUI really, really awesome. And these are just some of them. I think the most important one, the reason Maui took as long as it did, is because we decoupled all of the platform controls from our cross-platform implementations of those controls. So it's now easier to extend and modify, so you can add different app models, such as Model View Update instead of MVVM, which is what a lot of us use in the .NET desktop world. But we also make it so that it's very, very easy for us to add target platforms in the future. So if we ever wanted to extend to something beyond the 4 that we have today, Android, iOS, Mac, and Windows, we could do that. Of course, there's a bunch of other stuff. I mean, unification with .NET is a huge thing. That's the whole reason we're able to do the Blazor hybrid goodness. And we have a lot of the things that you love from Xamarin. .NET MAUI is an evolution of Xamarin and Xamarin Forms. So Shell, which is our navigation stack that we introduced in Xamarin Forms 4, we have that in MAUI. It is amazing, and it's refactored, so it's even more performant, more consistent, and it's more maintainable for both us and you as our end developer. So with MAUI, you get a lot of things in the box and easy to get if it's not in the box. On the left here, you have a ton of things that you kind of get for free. 7 layouts, 44 views in the box with MAUI, along with our Essentials library, which is how you get all of those device-specific APIs in a cross-platform way. So things like accessing geolocation or opening a file picker or seeing the accelerometer or checking connectivity of the device. All of those things are built right into MAUI, along with our graphics library. So you can draw your own controls if you don't want to use the native ones under the hood. And then there's Xamarin Forms compatibility, and of course the amazing .NET MAUI community toolkit, which has a whole bunch of other things that you can add into your MAUI app. Another package you can just pull in on NuGet and do way more. And it's all open source, so you can go check all of it out and, of course, contribute back. There's a bunch of new capabilities when you compare MAUI to Xamarin and Xamarin Forms, including, of course, the Blazor web view. That's how all the magic with Blazor Hybrid happens, but also the ability to set an app icon, a splash screen, and add images all in a cross-platform shared way. So you can literally take a foreground image and say, this is my app icon, and the background color should be this. And that will also be my splash screen, and just do that in some XML. And then it just works on all the platforms magically. It's probably my favorite feature of MAUI, if you can't tell by how excited I am about it. And of course, there are some changes. We will talk at the end of this a little bit about how to upgrade if you are coming from Xamarin and you're not new to .NET MAUI and .NET cross-platform development altogether. But little things changed. The namespace, obviously, it's no longer using Xamarin Forms, it's using Microsoft.MAUI, but we'll talk about how to get your apps updated. The most important thing is that, no, it is not a rewrite of your application. The flavor of XAML and almost all of the APIs have remained exactly the same. There are very select ones we changed because we thought it was time for a change, and we got to undo some of the mistakes or choices we made in the past that we have grown out of. A couple examples quickly of things that we have done in MAUI to make making beautiful apps super, super easy. I think shadow is my favorite. This is all you have to do to add a drop shadow to an image. You have the offset, you have the radius of the shadow, you have the opacity of it, and that's it. Like, it's just the .NET bot, add a shadow to it. That's all the code you have to do. And that's, of course, in XAML. You can do this in C# if you prefer C#, but we use XAML by default for a lot of our examples. Same thing with adding something like a border. If you are coming from other cross-platform frameworks or from Xamarin, you know that adding a border to buttons or to certain rectangles or something was always the most difficult thing. Like, you had to drop down to the native platform and add it in all these particular ways. And we have made it easy. We brought it back up to the cross-platform layer. We have all of the different stroke modifiers that you could possibly want to make your border beautiful. You have your corner radius. It's awesome. And it's all .NET MAUI. This screenshot is from Preview 9, if you can tell. We are now GA. We are no longer in Preview 9. You can do this right now in your apps. It's very exciting. One of the things that would be, that it would be really incomplete of us to talk about MAUI without is our performance work we've done. So we've done a lot of performance work across the board with .NET. .NET 6 was hugely performant. .NET 7 is going to continue to be hugely performant. So we've done the same thing with MAUI. This one is the comparison of a .NET MAUI template compared to a Xamarin Forms template. Just going to click it real quick. Look how much faster the one on the right loaded up. I'm going to go back, do it one more time. Go back. What? so much faster. It's almost 35% faster than Xamarin Forms. And we've done it with big apps too, not just the default sample app. And there are still a lot of improvements. A lot of that comes from optimizations for XAML-C, the XAML compiler, and some basic changes we made under the hood, some sane defaults we made to make everything a lot faster. And of course, we have the comparison to native itself. So this is a Xamarin Android app, and then the .NET Android app comes up much faster. .NET 6 Android is way faster. Way less system reflection emit is kind of the big one. If you've heard of this before, you know that's probably how we got a lot of the performance improvements. So, boom, that's it. Oh, keep playing it back. .NET MAUI, if you want to start using it today, like I mentioned at the beginning, it is in preview currently. It is in the preview branch of Visual Studio. So that's 17.3 as of right now. You can go in to the modifier for your workload installer and click off mobile development with .NET. And then the .NET MAUI preview button right down here, check it off. That installs everything you need to get started. When 17.3 goes GA, which will be later because we just shipped 17.2, we are going to update this workload to say .NET MAUI instead of Xamarin. The checkbox is going to be on by default. And what you can start using today and what you will continue to see improvements on until we ship 17.3 GA is all of your hot tools, your hot reloads, the property pages, the publishing experience for all the different target platforms you want, and many, many more tooling updates and fixes we've made. You might be a Mac developer. If you are a Visual Studio for Mac developer, that's awesome. We are also having .NET MAUI supported on the Mac, of course. It's going to be in preview as well. So you're going to want to get the preview release of Visual Studio for Mac, which is currently 17.1. We are aiming for general availability with 17.2 Visual Studio for Mac. So it's a little bit confusing because it's the same kind of numbers, but they're not at the same time. But this would be roughly the release in the fall. And that highly depends on how many bugs we have filed on us based on your feedback when you test it out. We're going to focus on the building blocks first. That's what you can start using in the preview branch now. Things like just building, deploying, debugging, and XAML hot reloading. But we're going to bring in a lot more tooling later as we continue through the release process and nail things down. If you're wondering, just a heads up, Xamarin development is totally stable with 17.0 GA on the Mac. So yes, you can keep doing Xamarin work, which kind of begs the question, you know, what does this look like, right? In the time frame that we have coming up. We've been saying May and 17.3 and 17.2 and GA and blah, 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 and .NET 7. Here is a kind of rudimentary look at our roadmap. Really where we are is here. We're in May. Happy build, everybody. We have the VS Mac 17.1 preview with MAUI and the VS 2022 on Windows 17.3 preview with MAUI. But of course, the MAUI SDK itself is GA. It has the go live licensing you need to start shipping apps with it. And then we will have kind of a bump in the MAUI versioning over the summer when we GA the Windows tooling experience, when we have a little bit more updates for Mac, so that in the fall, you can have a full Visual Studio for Mac and Windows .NET MAUI developer experience around the same time that .NET 7 GA is out. And we've announced .NET Conf, those dates, so mark our calendars. That'll be happening in November. Very exciting. This is kind of just a slide summarizing that past slide in text. So if you go back to look at this without audio, you might be able to follow it better. But really what we're asking in May is that you start new mobile and desktop projects with .NET MAUI. If you have not, used it before, just file new, check it out, tell us how you like it. If you are currently on Xamarin or Xamarin Forms, you can start evaluating the migration and provide some feedback to us if you'd like, especially what NuGet packages aren't available yet, what doesn't look right when you finish migrating. And like I said earlier, we will talk about the Upgrade Assistant and how that works for you. So some of the things we're looking at for .NET 7, and this is obviously subject to change as all things are, but what's top of mind right now is we want to get better map support and dual screen support. But of course, better quality and performance across the board. We want to continue to fix bugs as much as possible. and improve platform interop. And that means that if you do something with a native Android or iOS or Mac library that you can't access from .NET, it doesn't have a .NET SDK, we want to make it easier for you to do those things. Got a lot of ideas about it. We'll figure it out. Look out for it in .NET 7, probably in an experimental way. There's also a lot of investigations. People ask, what about this? What about this? What about Linux? What about MVU? What about drawing? Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of opportunities. You can check out our GitHub. You can check out the discussions tab of github.com/.net/Maui. And a lot of these things are on there. Feel free to drop in your thoughts. I mean, we just shipped GA of this thing, so we're going to get our feet on the ground and continue to listen to customer feedback, to your feedback, to the developer communities that we have both in .NET and in the greater developer ecosystem, and see where we can go next, not just .NET 7, but also .NET 8 and beyond, .NET 10,000. I don't know if we'll ever get there. Hopefully we do. If you're on Xamarin, you probably are wondering, what happens to my Xamarin apps? Great question. Well, it's part of the modern support lifecycle. So it's going to be supported 2 years from the last release, which was November. So you will have Xamarin support through November 2023. That's all you need. If you don't want to migrate to Maui right away, you don't have to. Don't feel the pressure. We would love for you to, because we think it's pretty great. And we also think that you can, start taking advantage of things with very little effort. But we get it. Some people aren't ready. That's okay. It's new. We're excited. If you do want to update right away, which you totally should because it's the best, you can keep an eye out for this summer, around the same time that the Windows tooling 17.3 goes GA. The .NET Upgrade Assistant will have support for .NET Maui. So you might have heard of .NET Upgrade Assistant in some different contexts, getting your apps from framework to core, whether that's WPF or WinForms or some of the web stacks we have. We are extending the open source .NET Upgrade Assistant tool to support Xamarin Forms to .NET Maui or Xamarin Native to .NET 6 native apps. It's going to update your CS proj file, that project file that tells Visual Studio what is going on in your project. It's going to move it to the modern SDK style project. It's going to change your target frameworks to be correct for .NET 6 and let you start taking advantage of the single project stuff we have. We'll change your namespaces. We'll change most of the APIs that we can kind of find and replace pretty easily. We'll do that all for you, so you don't have to do that find and replace. And then we are also going to work on a NuGet updater tool that's part of .NET Upgrade Assistant to kind of intelligently replace NuGets with ones that are from ones that are compatible with Xamarin Forms to ones that are compatible with .NET Maui. If you are a library maintainer or someone in our community who has something on NuGet and you're worried about upgrading to .NET Maui or supporting .NET Maui for your customers, please, please, please. My email is Maddie, M-A-D-D-Y, @Microsoft.com. And we are more than happy to chat with you, learn a lot about what's going on, what your concerns are, and kind of help you through the update process so you can get our community on Maui. So get started today. Very excited. I hope you enjoy Build and have enjoyed all of the content the teams have put together for you. These are some of the important links, but most importantly, you want to get the Visual Studio Preview, .NET 6, and of course, .NET Maui will be installed with the Visual Studio Preview. That's all you need to get started. So thank you so much for joining me. You just heard my email, so feel free to reach out with any questions, and we'll make sure we continue to tweet out all the great links and things that we share during Build this year. So thank you, everybody.
Това беше последното видео от ивента, който организираме днес. Очаквайте още много събития, тъй като събитията се връщат на живо. Това лято имаме много събития в България. Ще продължим съответно и когато е възможно да стримваме част от тази информация. Благодаря ви за участието и се надявам да се видим скоро, най-късно на 11 юни в Пловдив. Благодаря ви.